On the evening of June 7, 1941, in a third-floor room of the Olympic Hotel on 8th Street in downtown Los Angeles, a 38-year-old Japanese man in a dark civilian suit was finishing his work for the day. He had a small leather valise open on the desk. He had 2 notebooks beside it. He had a half-empty cup of tea, which was already cold, and a stack of typed pages held together by a paperclip in the upper left corner. The pages were in Japanese. They described, in detail, the docking schedule of the United States Pacific Fleet at the Long Beach Naval Anchorage for the previous 14 days. They listed the hull numbers of every battleship and heavy cruiser that had entered or departed the anchorage. They noted, for each ship, the duration of the visit, the apparent state of provisioning, and the number of officers observed coming ashore in dress whites. The pages had not yet been transmitted. They had not yet been ciphered. They were to be carried the following morning by a third party to the office of the Japanese Consul General on West 4th Street. The man at the desk was a commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy. His name was Itaru Tachibana. He had arrived in the United States 26 months earlier on a student visa, registered at the University of Southern California as an English language student. He had not attended a single class.
At approximately 7:15 in the evening, there was a knock at the door of room 308. Tachibana looked up. He set down the pencil he had been using. He walked to the door. He opened it. 6 men were standing in the hallway. 4 of them were special agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2 were officers of the Office of Naval Intelligence. The senior agent, who would later sign the arrest report, identified himself by name and presented a warrant. The warrant cited the suspected violation of federal statutes governing the unauthorized gathering of national defense information by foreign nationals. Tachibana did not resist. He stepped back from the door. He allowed the agents to enter. He watched, in silence, as they began to inventory the contents of the room. By the end of the night, the agents had photographed and seized 107 pages of documents from the hotel room. The documents included the Long Beach observation reports. They included sketches of the harbor mole at San Pedro. They included a small notebook with the names and home addresses of 17 Japanese-American men living in Los Angeles, San Diego, and the agricultural valleys north of the city. They included a single typed sheet that listed by tail number 12 aircraft observed at the Lockheed plant in Burbank during the preceding month. The senior FBI agent later wrote in a memorandum to J. Edgar Hoover that the seizure represented the most substantial collection of foreign naval intelligence documents ever recovered from a single hotel room on American soil.
The story that the documents in room 308 begin to tell is not the story that most Americans, even those who lived through the Pacific War, were ever fully told. It is the story of a Japanese naval intelligence operation that had been quietly active along the coast of California, the coast of Washington, and the harbor of Honolulu for approximately 12 years before the morning of December 7th, 1941. It is a story of officers in civilian suits, language school cover identities, cutouts recruited from the Japanese-American community, and a small number of non-Japanese collaborators, including a former British Royal Navy aviator and an out-of-work Hollywood seaman who had been persuaded, for reasons of money or grievance, to assist. It is also a story of how that operation ended in the early months of 1941, not through American counterintelligence brilliance, but through a single recruitment attempt that went badly wrong, and through a series of arrests that the United States government, for reasons of diplomatic delicacy, chose not to prosecute publicly. Within 6 months of the arrest at the Olympic Hotel, the United States and Japan would be at war. Within 12 months, most of the men whose names appeared in Tachibana's small notebook would be inside the wire fences of the Manzanar internment camp. Most of them would never be prosecuted for espionage. Most of them would never be cleared of suspicion either. They would simply vanish into the administrative machinery of the war,
To understand how a serving commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy came to be sitting in a Los Angeles hotel room in June 1941, typing notes on the position of American battleships, you have to go back 12 years before the arrest. You have to go back to the year 1929 and to a small office on the second floor of the Naval Ministry building in Tokyo, where a quiet, bureaucratic decision was made. The decision was made by the 3rd Bureau of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The 3rd Bureau in 1929 was the intelligence division of the Navy. It was small. It had a permanent staff of approximately 40 officers. It operated on a budget that, by the standards of the major naval powers, was modest. It had, in the years following the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, been given a specific assignment by the senior leadership of the Navy. The assignment was to assess in detail and over the long term the warfighting capability of the United States Navy in the Pacific. The 3rd Bureau was to identify the major American fleet anchorages. It was to catalog the production capacity of the major American aircraft manufacturers. It was to monitor the construction of new American warships in the shipyards of the East Coast and the West Coast. It was to track, in particular, the fuel infrastructure that supported American naval operations across the Pacific. The assignment was open-ended. It had no specific deadline. The officers given the task understood that they were preparing for a contingency that the Navy hoped would never arrive. They were preparing, methodically and without urgency, for a war.
The first organized Japanese naval intelligence presence in the United States, established by the 3rd Bureau in the early 1930s, did not look anything like an espionage operation. It looked like a small group of Japanese naval officers who had been assigned to the office of the naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C., and who held standard diplomatic credentials. They lived in modest apartments, they attended embassy functions, they corresponded openly with American naval officers about technical matters of mutual professional interest. They subscribed to the trade journals. They visited the public sections of the major American naval shipyards on official tours. Almost everything they did was legal. Most of it was unclassified. Much of it was published in some form in American newspapers and naval periodicals that anyone with a library card could read. The 3rd Bureau, in 1929, had concluded that the United States Navy was unusually generous with information about itself. The American press routinely published the names, hull numbers, and assignments of major warships. The Congressional Record contained detailed appropriations debates about naval construction. Trade publications listed production figures for the major aircraft manufacturers. The major shipyards held public open days. Visiting officers from foreign navies were, as a matter of professional courtesy, given guided tours of facilities that in any other major naval power would have required years of negotiation to enter. The first task of the Japanese naval attachés in Washington was simply to read carefully, to collate, to send what they had read back to Tokyo.
By 1932, the open source collection effort had produced a substantial body of intelligence. The 3rd Bureau in Tokyo had compiled, for the first time, a comprehensive directory of the United States Pacific Fleet, ship by ship, with assignments, recent movements, and probable future deployments. The directory was useful. It was also limited. What the open sources could not provide was operational detail. They could not provide the exact fueling schedule of an individual battleship. They could not provide the production rate of a specific model of dive bomber at a specific Lockheed assembly line. They could not provide the dock plan of the Long Beach naval anchorage with sufficient precision to support, hypothetically, a torpedo attack from a small submarine. They could not provide the names of the senior officers of the Pacific Fleet flagship and the patterns of those officers' shore leave. For that level of detail, the 3rd Bureau would need observers on the West Coast. It would need them not in Washington, D.C., where the Navy already had its formal presence,
but in California and Washington state, where the actual American fleet was based. The decision to expand the operation westward was taken in late 1933. It was implemented gradually over the following 5 years. The first naval intelligence officers to arrive on the West Coast traveled on student visas. They registered at American universities. They studied English. They lived in modest accommodations near the Japanese consulates of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle. They were, on paper, language students. They were, in fact, the advanced staff of an intelligence collection network that would, by 1940, run from San Diego to Vancouver Island.
The use of the student visa cover identity by serving naval officers of a foreign power was not, in 1933, an obvious choice. It carried risks. A naval commander in his mid-30s, registered as an undergraduate English student, would attract attention if anyone in the Bureau of Immigration looked carefully at the paperwork. The Third Bureau accepted the risk for two specific reasons. The first was that the alternatives were worse. A serving officer placed under formal diplomatic cover at one of the West Coast consulates would have been more difficult to disguise. The American government maintained, even before the war, a careful watch on the staffing of foreign consulates in militarily sensitive zones. The arrival of a senior naval commander at the consulate in Los Angeles or San Francisco would have been noted, reported to the Office of Naval Intelligence, and likely surveilled within weeks. The second was that the language student cover, while implausible on close inspection, was excellent at a distance. The University of Southern California, the University of California at Berkeley, the University of Washington, all of them admitted dozens of Japanese students every year for legitimate English language study. A serving commander disguised as one more was, in the records of the Immigration Service, statistically invisible. The arrangement carried one additional advantage. A naval officer on student status was, by the conventions of international law, as understood in 1933, not entitled to diplomatic immunity. If caught, he could be prosecuted. The American counterintelligence services were, the Third Bureau correctly assumed, unlikely to look closely at a foreign student who appeared to be doing nothing unusual. For the first 8 years, the assumption held.
The early arrivals settled into routines that the Third Bureau would, by the late 1930s, regard as standard tradecraft for the West Coast network. They lived in inexpensive rented rooms within walking distance of the Japanese consulate. They took coffee 3 or 4 times a week at small Japanese-owned cafes in the Little Tokyo districts of Los Angeles and San Francisco. They made no effort to conceal their nationality. They were polite, well-dressed, and unobtrusively present at the social functions of the local Japanese-American community. They contributed small sums to community organizations. They occasionally lectured, in Japanese, on naval history at language schools in Boyle Heights or Sautel. They did not, in the early period, attempt to recruit anyone. The Third Bureau had concluded, after careful internal debate, that the recruitment of Japanese-American citizens, most of whom were Nisei, born in the United States, holding American passports, and oriented toward American civic life, was operationally counterproductive. The Nisei community, in the assessment of the Tokyo planners, was not a reliable pool of assets. Most of its members regarded themselves as American. Many of them spoke poor Japanese. Few of them had close family connections remaining in Japan. The Issei community, the first-generation immigrants, born in Japan, holding Japanese passports, was a different matter. The Issei were, by the legal provisions of the 1924 Immigration Act, prohibited from becoming American citizens. They held Japanese nationality permanently. They were, in the language of the Third Bureau memoranda, the natural reserve from which the operation could, when necessary, draw discreet support. The Third Bureau did not, in the early years, draw on that reserve openly. It kept the option in reserve. The reserve would be activated deliberately and quietly, beginning in 1939.
Commander Itaru Tachibana arrived in Los Angeles on the morning of April 3, 1939. He was 36 years old. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Itajima in the class of 1923. He had served at sea in the Pacific cruiser squadrons for most of the 1920s. He had attended the Naval War College in Tokyo in 1933. He had been assigned to the 3rd Bureau in 1936. He spoke English, by the assessment of the 3rd Bureau, at a level adequate for daily life, but not for sophisticated conversation. His cover documents listed him as a private language student. He was registered for evening English language courses at the University of Southern California. He had paid the first semester's tuition. He had attended the registration interview. He had been issued a student identification card. He had not, in the 26 months that would follow, attend a single classroom session. What he had done, almost from the day he arrived, was establish a routine. He took breakfast at a small Japanese cafe on 1st Street in Little Tokyo. He spent the morning at the desk in his hotel room writing reports. In the afternoon, he walked or took the streetcar to one of the locations he had been assigned to observe. Most commonly, the Pacific docks at San Pedro, the harbor approaches at Long Beach, or the perimeter fence of the Lockheed aircraft plant at Burbank. He returned in the early evening. He typed up his observations. He delivered the typed pages twice a week to a courier at the Japanese consulate on West 4th Street. Tachibana lived, throughout this period, at the Olympic Hotel. The Olympic was a modest establishment on 8th Street, in the section of downtown Los Angeles that catered to traveling salesmen, lower-tier business visitors, and the occasional vacationing family from the agricultural valleys. It was not the kind of hotel where a senior naval officer of a foreign power might be expected to live. That, in the 3rd Bureau's assessment, was precisely its operational advantage. The Olympic had no permanent staff who would notice a guest who never left for long. The desk clerks rotated. The maid service was perfunctory. The rooms were rarely inspected. Tachibana paid in cash, by the month, in advance. He kept his door locked at all times. He carried his notebook with him whenever he left the room. He kept the typed reports in the valise on the desk, under a thin layer of personal papers, bills, postcards, language school receipts, that would, to a casual inspection, appear unremarkable. He understood that his cover was thin. He had been trained to assume that he was, at some level, under surveillance. He had been trained to assume that the surveillance was not, at his level of operational activity, likely to be aggressive. He was correct about both assumptions, for almost 2 years. By early 1941, the operation had begun to require things that Tachibana, working alone, could no longer provide. He could observe the docks. He could read the trade press. He could photograph, from a distance, what could be photographed from a public street. He could not, however, easily obtain the kind of close-quarters operational details that the 3rd Bureau had begun, in the months after the German invasion of France, to demand with increasing specificity. For that, he would need to recruit.
The first person Tachibana recruited was a man he had known, indirectly, for almost 2 decades. His name was Toraichi Kono. He was, in the spring of 1941, 53 years old. He had been born in a village in Hiroshima Prefecture in 1888. He had emigrated to the United States in 1910. He had worked, briefly, as a houseboy in a wealthy Pasadena household. In 1916, by an introduction from a mutual acquaintance, he had been hired by a young English comedian who had recently arrived in Hollywood and who had just begun to acquire the income that would shortly make him one of the most famous men in the world. The comedian was Charlie Chaplin. Kono was hired initially as Chaplin's driver. Within months, he was Chaplin's personal secretary. Within a year, he was the manager of the Chaplin household. He held the position, in various forms, for the next 18 years.
In 1934, Kono was dismissed by Chaplin under circumstances that the two men later described differently. Kono believed he had been fired because of a private dispute. Chaplin's later memoirs suggested that the dismissal had been ordinary attrition. Whatever the cause, Kono left the Chaplin household with 18 years of senior service, no severance package, no clear next position, and a degree of personal bitterness that had not, by 1941, entirely faded. Tachibana had first met Kono in Japan in 1932, during one of Chaplin's tours of Tokyo. The two had been introduced at a reception. They had stayed in distant contact in the years afterward. When Tachibana arrived in Los Angeles in 1939, Kono was, by the standards of an intelligence officer assessing potential local assets, ideally placed. He was an Issei. He held Japanese citizenship. He knew the upper-class Hollywood social world. He had personal grievances. He needed money.
Tachibana approached Kono in the early winter of 1941. The approach was indirect. It was made through a third party, a Japanese-American businessman in Little Tokyo who had no operational knowledge of what was being arranged. The businessman conveyed a message that an old acquaintance from Tokyo would like to meet for tea. Kono accepted. The meeting took place at a small restaurant in Boyle Heights. It was uneventful. It was followed by a second meeting, 2 weeks later, at a different location. By the end of the third meeting, Tachibana had made a proposal. He did not, in his account of the conversation, frame the proposal as espionage. He framed it as a personal favor between Japanese countrymen. He explained that the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles required certain kinds of social information that could only be obtained through someone with Kono's connections. He explained that the consulate was willing to pay, modestly but reliably, for the information. He explained that nothing of what would be requested was, in his understanding, a violation of any American law. This was not strictly true. It was true at the margins. Kono, in his later FBI interrogation, would describe his initial agreement as a decision he made on the assumption that what he was being asked to do was minor. He would describe his subsequent activities as a gradual escalation, in which each new request was slightly more substantial than the one before it, but never so much more substantial that it would, in itself, have justified refusal. By the spring of 1941, Kono was actively soliciting other potential assets on Tachibana's behalf. He was, in the operational language of the Third Bureau, a fully developed cutout. He was the bridge between the Japanese naval commander at the Olympic Hotel and the network of marginal contacts in the American Pacific defense industry that the operation needed to reach. The most consequential contact Kono would attempt to develop was a man named Al Blake.
The intelligence requirements that the Third Bureau in Tokyo was generating in the months between the German invasion of Poland and the spring of 1941 had a specific operational shape. They were not, primarily, requirements for strategic assessment. The Japanese naval staff already had a strategic assessment of the United States. It had been refined for almost 20 years. The Americans, in that assessment, were industrially superior, geographically distant, politically reluctant to engage in foreign wars, and bureaucratically slow to mobilize. The Japanese Navy did not need additional confirmation of any of this. What it needed was tactical detail. It needed, in the event of war, the kind of operational picture that would allow Japanese fleet commanders to make specific decisions about specific objectives in specific places at specific times. The first priority, by a wide margin, was the United States Pacific Fleet. The fleet's main anchorages on the West Coast were at Long Beach, San Pedro, and San Diego. Its operational pattern throughout 1940 was a rotation between these West Coast anchorages and the forward base at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands. The Third Bureau wanted, in as much detail as Tachibana could provide, the dates of the rotations, the composition of the units involved, the duration of each anchorage period, and the standard pattern of the officer's shore activity. Tachibana provided this information, week by week, for almost 2 years.
the reports were always not accurate. They were rarely complete. They were, however, consistent and methodical. They were, by Third Bureau standards, useful.
The second priority was American aircraft production. The major West Coast aircraft manufacturers, Lockheed at Burbank, Douglas at Santa Monica and Long Beach, Northrop at Hawthorne, North American at Inglewood, were, by 1940, producing combat aircraft at a rate that the Japanese naval staff regarded with both interest and concern. The interest was technical. The concern was that the rate of production, if sustained over the course of a multi-year war, would eventually exceed the rate of production of the Japanese aircraft industry by a margin that would become operationally decisive. The Third Bureau wanted production figures. It wanted them broken out by model, by month, by destination. It wanted, where possible, the names of the senior engineering staff working on specific projects and the apparent state of development of those projects. Tachibana could not, from a hotel room in downtown Los Angeles, obtain any of this with precision. He could observe the perimeter of the Lockheed plant. He could count, from a public road, the aircraft visible on the tarmac on a given afternoon. He could read the technical press. He could occasionally debrief Japanese-American workers who held minor positions at the plants and who were willing to talk, over tea, about what they had seen during their shifts. The information he produced was fragmentary. It was, however, the only information the Third Bureau had. Tokyo accepted it and asked for more. By early 1941, the demand for more had become explicit. The Third Bureau wanted, specifically, the production figures for the Lockheed P-38 fighter, which had begun rolling off the Burbank assembly line in the second half of 1940. Tachibana, unable to obtain the figures through any of his existing channels, began to consider whether the channels themselves needed to be expanded.
The third priority, less prominent in the reports than the fleet and the aircraft plants, but in some ways more strategically significant, was the American petroleum infrastructure on the Pacific coast. The American Pacific Fleet ran on fuel oil. The fuel oil came from the refineries at El Segundo, at Wilmington, at Long Beach. The refineries were supplied by the Southern California oil fields and by the coastal tanker traffic that brought crude from Alaska and from the Gulf of Mexico. The fuel oil was stored in vast quantities at the naval fuel depots adjacent to the major anchorages. The depots were among the largest such facilities in the world. The Third Bureau wanted, in detail, the location of every above-ground fuel tank within 10 miles of the major naval anchorages. It wanted the approximate capacity of each tank. It wanted the supply pipelines mapped. It wanted, in particular, the throughput rate of the loading piers that transferred fuel from the refineries to the warships. The Japanese naval planners were, even in 1940, considering scenarios in which the destruction of the West Coast fuel infrastructure could, by itself, immobilize the Pacific Fleet for months. The scenarios were preliminary. They were not, in the official records that survive, ever developed into formal operational plans for an attack on the American mainland. They informed, however, the intelligence requirements that flowed back to Tachibana in Los Angeles. He drove the coast road weekly. He counted tanks. He noted pipelines. He sketched, in the small notebook he carried in his jacket pocket, the layout of facilities.
There was a fourth category of intelligence that Tachibana was asked to collect, less systematically than the others, but with growing urgency through the spring of 1941. This was political intelligence. The Third Bureau wanted to know, in approximate terms, what the senior leadership of the United States Navy was thinking about the worsening situation in the Pacific. It wanted to know whether the fleet commanders in Hawaii were preparing for a Japanese first strike,
or whether they were treating the diplomatic crisis as a problem that would be resolved without combat. It wanted to know the names of the officers who would, in the event of war, command the major American operational formations. Some of this was available through the open press. The American newspapers in 1940 and 41 covered the diplomatic exchanges between Tokyo and Washington in considerable detail. The names of the senior American admirals were public knowledge. Their photographs appeared regularly in news magazines. What was not available through the press was the internal mood. Tachibana attempted, through Kono and through one or two other developing assets, to obtain information about the social conversations of senior American naval officers stationed on the West Coast. He sought reports from waiters at the officers' clubs in San Diego and Long Beach. He sought information from the wives of junior officers, who, in the social circles of military Los Angeles, occasionally repeated remarks they had overheard at home. What he produced was, by his own later admission to his Third Bureau superiors, of limited value. The senior American officers, even in their unguarded moments, did not appear to be saying anything that could be reduced to operationally useful intelligence. They appeared in the conversations that the Japanese network was able to.
Tachibana, in Los Angeles, was not working alone. The Third Bureau had, by the spring of 1941, established a parallel naval intelligence presence in the Pacific Northwest. The officer in charge of that presence was a commander of approximately Tachibana's seniority. His name was Sadatomo Okada. He was based in Seattle. He held the formal cover position of Assistant Naval Attaché. He worked, in close coordination with the Japanese Consulate General in Seattle, on a portfolio of intelligence requirements that focused on the Pacific Northwest sector of the American war industry. Okada's targets were complementary to Tachibana's. Where Tachibana was concerned with the Pacific Fleet and the Southern California aircraft plants, Okada was concerned with the Boeing Aircraft Works in Seattle, the Bremerton Naval Shipyard, the submarine base at Bangor, and the merchant shipping traffic moving along the Inside Passage between Seattle and the Alaska ports. The two networks were not, in operational terms, integrated. They reported separately to Tokyo. They used separate cutouts. They maintained separate communication channels. The Third Bureau had concluded, after analysis of the comparative compromise risks, that the compartmentalization of the two efforts reduced the probability of a single counterintelligence breakthrough compromising both. The compartmentalization would, in June 1941, prove to be only partially effective. When ONI agents searched Tachibana's hotel room at the Olympic, the materials they recovered included, by inadvertence, several references to Okada's operation. The Office of Naval Intelligence took note. Okada, who was at that moment in Seattle, was placed under intensified surveillance. He would be expelled from the United States within months.
There was a third major node in the West Coast network. It was at Honolulu. The Honolulu operation was structurally different from the California and Pacific Northwest operations. It was not run by a serving naval officer under student cover. It was run, after late March 1941, by a junior diplomat at the Japanese Consulate General. His public name was Tadashi Morimura. His actual name was Takeo Yoshikawa. He was 29 years old. He was a graduate of the Naval Academy at Etajima, class of 1933. He had been forced to leave active naval service in 1936 for medical reasons. He had been recruited into the Third Bureau as a civilian intelligence analyst. He had been redeployed in 1940 as an undercover field officer. Yoshikawa's assignment was the most specific in the entire Pacific operation. He was to observe and report in continuous detail on the United States Pacific Fleet's anchorages and routines at Pearl Harbor. He went about the work in ways that were, by the standards of intelligence tradecraft, almost defiantly visible. He rented small aircraft and flew over the harbor. He swam in the harbor on weekends to assess underwater obstacles. He drank tea at the Shunchoro Tea House on Alewa Heights, from whose upper rooms the entire anchorage was visible.
He took photographs. He made sketches. He counted ships. The American counterintelligence services in Honolulu observed parts of this. They were aware that the Japanese consulate generated unusual quantities of cable traffic. They did not, in the months before December 1941, succeed in interrupting it.
The network had, in addition to its 3 Japanese principals, a small number of non-Japanese collaborators. The most operationally significant was a British man named Frederick Rutland. Rutland was, by background, an unlikely figure. He had served as a Royal Navy aviator during the First World War. He had earned the Distinguished Service Cross at the Battle of Jutland in 1916 for an action involving a seaplane launch under fire. He had been decorated again subsequently. He had emerged from the war in the early 1920s as one of the more accomplished aviators of his generation. He had also emerged with substantial financial debts and a reputation for personal grievances against the British naval establishment. He believed, with some justification, that his career advancement had been blocked. He looked, in the late 1920s, for alternative employment. The Imperial Japanese Navy hired him. He moved to Japan in 1923. He spent most of the next decade as a paid technical consultant to the Mitsubishi Aircraft Works, advising on the design of carrier aircraft. He was, by the standards of the period, well compensated. He was also recruited, formally though discreetly, by Japanese naval intelligence. By the late 1930s, Rutland was based in California. He held a residence permit. He held, on paper, a position as the West Coast representative of a Japanese trading firm. He was, in operational fact, a long-term agent of the Third Bureau, tasked with maintaining cover of business contacts in the American aviation industry. The FBI was aware of Rutland by 1940. The materials recovered from Tachibana's hotel room in June 1941 confirmed the operational relationship. Rutland would, within weeks, return to the United Kingdom under diplomatic pressure. He would be detained in Britain for the duration of the war.
The full extent of the network in the spring of 1941 has never been definitively reconstructed. The Tokyo records of the Third Bureau were, in the closing weeks of the Pacific War in August 1945, systematically destroyed. The officers who had run the operation were dispersed in the post-war demobilization. Some returned to civilian life, some were detained briefly by the Allied occupation authorities. None were prosecuted as intelligence officers. The few who later wrote memoirs did so cautiously, with attention to what could safely be disclosed. What is known from the American records is that the operation included a network of cutouts and informants distributed along the Pacific coast, from San Diego to Bellingham. Some were Issei, a small number were Nisei, a few were non-Japanese collaborators of the Rutland type. The total number of people who, by any defensible counterintelligence standard, were operationally active in the network has been estimated at between 40 and 120. The wider category of people who provided occasional, often unwitting information to the operation was much larger. The American counterintelligence assessment, made in the months before Pearl Harbor and refined in the years afterward, was that the Japanese network had succeeded in gathering substantial tactical intelligence about the American Pacific Fleet, the West Coast aircraft industry, and the petroleum infrastructure. It had not succeeded in penetrating any classified American operational plan. It had not anticipated, with any specificity, the American countermoves that would follow Pearl Harbor. In the calculus of intelligence performance, this was a mixed result. The Japanese knew in considerable detail what the Americans had. They did not know what the Americans would do with it. The operation that had run, undisturbed, for 12 years, was brought down by a recruitment attempt that failed in the most ordinary way possible. The intended recruit went to the police. His name was Albert Blake. He was, in the spring of 1941, approximately 50 years old. He was a former enlisted sailor of the United States Navy. He had served on the heavy cruiser USS Pennsylvania in the late 1920s. He had retired from naval service in the early 1930s. He had, in the years since, drifted through a series of marginal Los Angeles occupations: bit part actor, stage assistant, occasional construction work, that placed him, by 1941, in financial circumstances that an experienced intelligence cutout would have correctly identified as exploitable. Toraichi Kono identified them. Kono had met Blake socially, several years earlier, through the loose Hollywood network of former sailors and stagehands that constituted a particular subculture of Los Angeles in the late 1930s. The two men had stayed in occasional contact. In March 1941, Kono arranged a meeting at the home of a mutual acquaintance. The meeting was social. There was drink, there was conversation. Kono mentioned, in passing, that an old friend of his, a Japanese gentleman in Los Angeles on business, was interested in meeting Americans who had served in the Navy for the purpose of certain academic discussions about naval history. Blake agreed to meet the gentleman. The gentleman was, of course, Itaru Tachibana. The discussions, when they took place at a small restaurant in Boyle Heights several weeks later, were not academic.
Tachibana's proposal to Blake was the most operationally ambitious request the West Coast Network had ever made. He asked Blake to travel to Pearl Harbor. He asked him to make contact with sailors of the United States Pacific Fleet, who Blake might remember from his own service days. He asked him to obtain, through these contacts, detailed information about the fleet's anchorage patterns at Pearl Harbor, the standard operational routines of the major warships, and the security arrangements of the Hawaiian Naval District. He offered, in compensation, a substantial cash payment, an amount that, in Blake's later sworn testimony, exceeded several years of his then current income. Blake, in his account, accepted the offer in the moment. He took an initial cash advance. He committed to making the trip. He then walked the same evening to the nearest office of the Office of Naval Intelligence in downtown Los Angeles. He reported, in full, what had been proposed. His reasons, when he later explained them under oath, were partly patriotic and partly self-protective. He had served in the Navy. He had no intention of providing intelligence to a foreign power. He had also calculated, correctly, that the most likely outcome of a clandestine attempt to do so would be his eventual exposure and a federal prison sentence. By reporting the approach immediately, he positioned himself not as an espionage suspect, but as a confidential source assisting an active counterintelligence investigation. The ONI office that received his report recognized within minutes that he had handed them the first credible inside view of an operation that they had been attempting to map from the outside for several years.
The Office of Naval Intelligence acted carefully. It did not arrest Tachibana immediately. It did not warn Blake off. It instead used Blake for the next 2 months as a controlled asset. Blake continued to meet with Kono, and through Kono with Tachibana. Each meeting was reported, in detail, to ONI. Each cash advance Blake received was recorded. Each new operational request was forwarded to the senior counterintelligence officers in Washington, who began to assemble, from the cumulative material, the first comprehensive American picture of what the Japanese network had been doing on the West Coast. The picture was substantial. It was also, from the perspective of the FBI and the Office of Naval Intelligence, immediately politically delicate. The political delicacy had 2 layers. The first was diplomatic. The United States and Japan were, in the spring of 1941, still formally at peace. The negotiations in Washington
between Secretary of State Cordell Hull and the Japanese ambassadors were continuing. A public arrest of a serving Japanese naval commander on espionage charges would, the State Department feared, accelerate the deterioration of the diplomatic situation. The second layer was domestic. The materials Blake and the ONI surveillance were generating implicated, by direct or circumstantial connection, dozens of Japanese-American residents of Los Angeles. Most of them were Issei. Many of them had only the most peripheral involvement in the network: a meal taken with Tachibana, a small cash payment received as a translation fee, a letter delivered as a casual favor. The Justice Department, by late May,
By early June 1941, the ONI and FBI had concluded that the controlled operation had produced as much intelligence as it usefully could. Tachibana's operational tempo was, in the assessment of the surveillance teams, becoming risky enough that the operation might, at any time, generate evidence that would force a public response. The decision was taken, jointly between the FBI and ONI, to arrest Tachibana before the operation collapsed in some less manageable way. The arrest was scheduled for the evening of June 7th. The team that executed it had spent the previous 48 hours rehearsing the entry into the Olympic Hotel. The room had been mapped from prior surveillance. The expected location of the documents on the desk had been confirmed by an ONI source within the hotel. The arrest, when it took place, was technically uneventful. Tachibana, on the assessment of the senior agents present, made no attempt to resist or to destroy materials. The same night, in coordinated actions across Los Angeles, the FBI detained Toraichi Kono at his apartment. Two unnamed Issei contacts at separate addresses in Boyle Heights and Sawtell, and a single Japanese-American businessman at a residence in Pasadena. Blake, on whose testimony the entire sequence rested, was placed in protective custody and removed from Los Angeles for his own safety. The American press, which had been kept entirely outside the operation, learned of the arrests the following morning. The initial coverage was substantial. The Los Angeles Times ran the story above the fold. The New York Times carried it on the second page. The phrase "Japanese spy ring" appeared in editorials within 48 hours. The diplomatic response from Tokyo was swift and quiet. The Japanese ambassador requested, formally, that Tachibana be released and permitted to return to Japan.
The legal framework under which Tachibana had been arrested was, in 1941, relatively new. The Foreign Agents Registration Act had been passed by Congress in 1938. It required any person acting in the United States on behalf of a foreign government to register with the Justice Department and to disclose, in regular filings, the nature of the work being performed. The act had been adopted in response to the growing concern in the late 1930s about German and Italian propaganda operations in the United States. It applied, by its terms, equally to Japanese activities, though the Japanese case had not been the primary focus of the original legislation. Tachibana had not registered. He had been required to. His failure to do so was, by itself, a federal offense. The Justice Department, in preparing the case against Tachibana, weighed two options. The first was a public prosecution for espionage. The second was a quieter prosecution for the lesser charge of failure to register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The first carried potential prison sentences of up to 30 years. The second carried penalties measured in months. The first would require, in open court, the disclosure of substantial portions of the ONI and FBI surveillance methods. The second would not. The State Department, consulted on the question, expressed a strong preference for the second course. The diplomatic risks of an espionage trial in the climate of June 1941 were judged by Secretary Hull's office to be unacceptable.
The compromise that emerged after approximately 10 days of negotiation between the Justice Department, the State Department, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Japanese Embassy in Washington was the option that, in the moment, appeared to balance the competing interests least badly. Tachibana was charged formally with violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. He was released on bail. He was permitted to leave the United States. He sailed for Japan in late June 1941. He arrived in Yokohama in early July
He resumed, almost immediately, his duties at the 3rd Bureau in Tokyo. In September 1941, he was assigned to the planning staff of the operation that would, 3 months later, attack Pearl Harbor. The disposition of the other arrestees was less generous. Toraichi Kono, who held Japanese citizenship and could not be deported with the same diplomatic protection that had attached to Tachibana, was held by the FBI through the summer. He was eventually transferred to the custody of the Department of Justice. He would be held on various grounds for the next several years. He was never formally charged with espionage. He was never formally cleared of it. He would, in the end, spend most of the Pacific War in federal detention, including periods at the Department of Justice internment facility at Fort Missoula, Montana. The other Issei contacts arrested on June 7th were processed under various immigration statutes. Some were held briefly. Some were released on parole. All would be re-detained 6 months later under the mass internment orders that followed Pearl Harbor.
The American Counterintelligence Services drew 2 specific lessons from the Tachibana case. The first lesson was technical. The arrest had demonstrated that the existing surveillance capacity of the FBI and ONI on the West Coast was sufficient to detect and neutralize a foreign intelligence operation of the kind Tachibana had been running. The operational tradecraft of the Japanese network, the student visa cover, the cutout system, the modest hotel rooms, the small notebooks, was not, in the end, sophisticated enough to defeat sustained American observation, once that observation had been directed at the right targets. The second lesson was darker. The arrest had demonstrated that the cooperation between the Japanese naval officers and certain individual Issei residents of the West Coast had been, in specific instances, real. The number of such instances in the Tachibana case was small. The fact that any such instances existed, however, was used in the months that followed as evidence in a much broader argument that the entire West Coast Japanese-American community was, in some operational sense, a potential security threat. The argument was made most notably by senior officers of the Western Defense Command in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. It was made in modified form by officials of the Justice Department and the Department of War. It was opposed with considerable courage by a small number of internal voices, most notably the naval intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Ringel, who had served on the West Coast throughout the late 1930s, and who had concluded, on the basis of his own extensive investigation, that the vast majority of the Issei and Nisei communities posed no security threat of any kind. Ringel's report was substantially correct. It was substantially ignored.
The intelligence file that the Tachibana case generated in the months after the arrest was substantial. It included the materials recovered from the Olympic Hotel. It included the surveillance reports compiled by ONI and FBI through the spring of 1941. It included Al Blake's debriefing transcripts. It included, by the end of the year, the additional materials produced by the Magic Decryption operation, which had begun in the late 1930s to decipher portions of the Japanese diplomatic cable traffic between Tokyo and the consulates in the United States. The Magic intercepts confirmed, in considerable detail, what the arrest of Tachibana had already disclosed. The Japanese consulates in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and Honolulu were active nodes of an intelligence collection operation directed against American naval and industrial targets. The cable traffic between Tokyo and these consulates contained throughout the spring and summer and autumn of 1941 references to operational requirements, to specific intelligence questions, and to the answers being returned by the field officers. What the Magic intercepts did not provide in the months before Pearl Harbor was an explicit warning of the attack itself. The cables from Honolulu, in particular, the cables that Takeo Yoshikawa, under the name Tadashi Morimura, had been generating in increasingly specific detail about the fleet anchorage patterns, were intercepted, decrypted, and translated. They were, however, not always promptly distributed.
They were not, in the assessment of the relevant American intelligence reviewers, given the operational priority that, in retrospect, they had earned. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the operational consequences of that judgment became, for 2,403 Americans, terminal.
In the weeks after the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States government undertook the largest forced relocation of an ethnic civilian population in American history. Approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the Pacific coast, Issei and Nisei, immigrants and citizens, farmers and shopkeepers and university students and naval intelligence informants, were ordered to leave their homes. They were assembled at temporary collection points. They were transported by bus and train to a network of 10 internment camps, located for the most part in inland desert areas of the western United States. The camps were administered by a civilian agency called the War Relocation Authority. The largest of them, Manzanar, was located in the Owens Valley of California, in the rain shadow of the eastern Sierra Nevada. It held at its peak more than 10,000 people. The conditions were primitive. The camp consisted of tar paper barracks. The temperature swings between summer and winter were severe. The food was institutional. The sanitation was, in the first months, inadequate. The Issei contacts whose names had appeared in Tachibana's small notebook were almost without exception sent to the camps. So were the Issei who had never had any contact with Tachibana. So were the Nisei who held American citizenship. So were entire farming communities from California, Oregon, and Washington, whose only connection to the Japanese intelligence operation had been ethnic. The internment, in retrospect, was not a counterintelligence operation. It was a mass political response to a mass political pressure that, in the panic of late 1941 and early 1942, no significant American official was able or willing to resist.
The FBI did, in the early months after Pearl Harbor, attempt to use the internment as an opportunity to identify the active intelligence assets within the broader detained population. The attempt, in operational terms, was largely unsuccessful. The Bureau interviewed thousands of internees. It compared the names against the lists generated by the Tachibana case, by the parallel investigations in Seattle and San Francisco, and by the magic intercept material. It identified, by the standards of available evidence, a small number of individuals, fewer than 50 across the entire West Coast, about whom the operational suspicion was substantial. Of these, almost none could be prosecuted. The available evidence was, in most cases, fragmentary. Much of it had been gathered by intelligence methods that the government did not wish to disclose in open court. The few cases that proceeded to formal proceedings were resolved, in most instances, through deportation orders or through continued administrative detention, rather than through criminal conviction. The wider population of the camps was, by 1943, the subject of an entirely separate FBI assessment, which concluded that the security risk presented by the detained Japanese American community as a whole was negligible. The assessment was not made public. It contradicted the political rationale that had been used to justify the internment in the first place. Its existence would not be acknowledged in any significant way by the federal government until decades later. In the meantime, the camps remained.
The actual intelligence operatives of the Tachibana network, the ones who had been doing the work, taking the cash, writing the reports, vanished from the record by several different routes. Tachibana himself spent the Pacific War in Tokyo. He continued to work for the Third Bureau. He was assigned, at various points, to staff positions involving the planning of operations in the Central and South Pacific. He survived the war. He was briefly detained in 1945 by the Allied occupation authorities. He was not prosecuted. He was released. He returned to civilian life. He died of natural causes in 1954. He was 51.
Toraichi Kono spent most of the war in federal detention. He was held at Fort Missoula, at Santa Fe, at Crystal City. He was released after the war in 1946. He returned to Japan in the early 1950s. He died in Tokyo in 1971 at the age of 83. He never gave a full public account of his involvement in the operation. The fragments that survive come from his FBI interrogation transcripts, from a small number of interviews he gave to Japanese journalists late in his life, and from the recollections of those who had known him during his chaplain years. Frederick Whatland returned to Britain in 1941 under quiet diplomatic pressure. He was interned by the British government for the duration of the war. He was released in 1945. He lived in obscurity for the remainder of his life. He died by suicide in London in 1949 at the age of 63. Sadatomo Okada returned to Japan. He continued to serve in the Imperial Japanese Navy through the end of the war.
The Issei and Nisei, whose names had passed through the operation, sometimes as active assets, sometimes as marginal contacts, sometimes only as social acquaintances of one of the Japanese officers. These were the people who, in the strict sense of the phrase, vanished from the record. They went to the camps. They served out the war. They returned, when they were able, to communities and properties that had often been disrupted, sometimes ruined, and occasionally lost outright. They did not, in most cases, ever learn whether they had been on a particular list, in a particular notebook, in a particular FBI file. They did not learn whether the basis for their 3 years of detention had been, in their individual case, a real operational connection or a coincidence of geography and ancestry. The FBI did not, after the war, publish the names. The Department of Justice did not release the case files. The materials seized from Tachibana's hotel room at the Olympic, though cataloged and microfilmed, were classified for decades. Many of the relevant Japanese records, on the other side, had been destroyed in August 1945. What remained by the time historians began the systematic reconstruction of the operation in the 1970s and 1980s was a partial picture. The shape of the network was clear. The individual identities of the great majority of its peripheral contacts were not. The Issei who had taken a meeting with Tachibana over tea in 1940, the Nisei translator who had assisted with a single document, the Boyle Heights shopkeeper who had passed a message between Kono and an unknown third party, these people are present in the historical record only as anonymous figures in a counterintelligence file that, by the standards of the discipline, has never been fully closed. The intelligence network that had quietly mapped the coast of California for 12 years had, on the morning of June 8, 1941, become the operational case study around which an entire policy of mass internment would be constructed. The construction was political, not investigative. The people inside the camps would carry... The Tachibana case is not, in the standard accounts of the Pacific War, a central episode. It is overshadowed in almost every general history by the events that began 6 months after the arrest at the Olympic Hotel. The intelligence operation that had run for 12 years against the United States Pacific Fleet is mentioned, when it is mentioned at all, in a paragraph or a footnote. But the operation existed. The men existed. The notebooks existed. The decisions existed. And the people whose lives were brushed by the operation, sometimes by their own choice, sometimes not, paid the costs. What the Third Bureau had been preparing for all those years came in December 1941. What the United States government had not prepared for arrived on the same morning. What followed for the Japanese-American community on the West Coast would be a separate war, fought without weapons against a country most of them had spent their entire lives calling home. Next on Tora Files, the Japanese midget submarines that crossed the Pacific in December 1941, slipped into Pearl Harbor before the main attack began,
and were never accounted for in the way the Japanese naval staff had planned. Subscribe. The Pacific War, told from the other side.